The project you're embarking on is a really interesting one because you're taking an innovation that exists now and that is being applied to infants and asking people, well, what is going to be the impact of this on these children in 20 years?
We create the tools, and then the tools shape us, right? And that's the kind of the fundamental proposition of communication studies, or even, a large part of multimedia. It's like, how do we get into that? And this is really at the base of what your documentary is all about. How are the tools shaping our kids, our development? Are they altering the course of humanity? And if so, how?
This is Larissa and her younger sister Emily. They have many toys to play with, but their dad's iPad is certainly their favorite. Here's Larissa teaching Emily how to play a simple game about popping balloons. Here you see Emily reaching out past the water bottle to swipe at the iPad. Let's look at that again in slow motion. That looks like a deliberate action. In just a few months, Emily has become a pint-sized iPad Pro. And Larissa is doing even more advanced things. But there is no way that either of them could use a PC or laptop at this time because their minds are not developed enough. And if you think that's impressive, check out these prodigal toddlers. Here's a 1-year-old playing Angry Birds. Here's one who can already spell with her iPad, even though she can barely speak. What is that? And of course, there are lots of little musicians out there too.
Well, I think we're living in an era of hyper technology. Frankly, your documentary is about babies using iPads, right?
Do you have a starting point though from when that would be?
I would say it's been gradual, but I think the inflection point is the diffusion of the internet, right? The diffusion, and there are a number of factors at play though. It's the technology, yes, of course. It's the actual hardware and software, but it's also the networks. The networks have made it an ubiquitous experience, right? And the arrival of 4G, especially 4G networks, where you can pretty well take everything everywhere or anywhere. That is we're approaching that kind of hyper-technological stage, in my opinion.
You know, I think that the use of technology has developed a certain set of skills. There's no question about it. But I do think that it's taken away or interfered with, a certain set of skills, and also a certain set of experiences that I think are required for being, being really fully functioning adults.
Because it all revolves around information and access to information. And in Apple's case, they have arguably right now the best smartphone, and they have probably the best app market. And apps are just tiny little pockets of the internet that you can choose to put on your mobile device. And I don't think that mobile devices and tablets are going to go away or lose market share. I think they're going to continue to grow because they're so bloody convenient to have the internet at your hands at all times. It's an extension of your brain, really. It's almost part of your body, a smartphone now.
So I think the paradigm shift really with interactive devices now has opened this door for very young children to interact with these devices and gain knowledge that they couldn't previously gain other than through books or through more social type learning. So I think the experiment is being run, and the effects could be profound in terms of the abilities that young children may achieve in terms of human-computer interfaces, or it may be there's no difference in that, if you think about the television, people said that we're all going to become idiots and couch potatoes because we have television. And while a portion of the population probably has become more lethargic and more sedentary, I don't think it has drastically changed the entire nature of society in terms of their activity and active nature. I think in many ways it's enhanced society, and I think the iPad may do similar things in the future.
It might be a social experiment in a secondary way, because what it is actually a business model, right? It's a business model that's being pushed onto the market, and it seems to have found the perfect storm.
In terms of physical evolution, the human brain hasn't really changed that much in the past 40,000 years. But in terms of the evolution of thought and action, it has changed immensely. According to Clay Shirky, the differences between generations, such as the baby boomers, the Generation Xers, and the millennials, are largely superficial and exaggerated. The real differences, he says, are not in each generation's inherent values, but in each generation's opportunities to experience things.
Emerging of the computer in the mind?
Yeah.
Well, I see the cell phone, for example, as being an extension of the brain, a type of long-term memory or an archive that I have access to. It's a little bit slower to pull stuff up, but I believe that it's already happened.
I think it's a matter more of, there's a qualitative difference, yes, but is it a fundamental transformation, or is it actually more of the same? I take a more kind of gradualist approach, right? That there's we tend to overestimate the short-term effects of a technology and underestimate the long-term effects, right? Because we don't know, we can't see.
I think that it simply shows, or has given us an opportunity to see, the importance of gestures and how they emerge early on and how they can be used very, very easily by the very young. And of course, we watch language emerge, and there's been studies of language acquisition now for decades. But no study that I know of gesture acquisition. And then we have commandos, who, special forces, who operate under extreme hostile conditions and have developed signaling systems, hand signaling systems, to ensure the stealth of their attack or their operation. And these are quite elaborate. I don't know them, but I have seen a few in action. And they suffice to carry out actions in the battlefield without a single syllable being uttered.
The connection between language production and language perception has been discussed in the literature for decades. The idea that a child will be able to perceive language long before they can actually produce the same utterances is well known, and there's a small movement to teach children sign language in order to communicate, because the idea being they just don't have the articulation to form the words, but they can communicate simple concepts through sign. So the iPad may open a door or a window for these children to communicate ideas in a more proficient manner. And it may actually lead to more sophisticated cognitive thinking styles, because they can communicate ideas that previously they couldn't. Now, there may be a flip side or a downside to that they may have delayed language processing. So given that they can communicate with the iPad, why learn to speak? Now, I don't have any data to support that either way, but it's a plausible account that if the child has no motivation to learn or need to communicate because they can communicate through this device, that may retard language acquisition.
It's a little bit too early in the development of for people to really know, I would think. But yeah, I mean, I think I'm surprised that anybody would have an answer for that at this early stage in their use.
Well, I think that the answer is we don't know yet. I mean, these tablets have come out fairly recently, and in the span of the history of technology, they're maybe about 2 or 3, 4 years old at the most. If you're talking about smartphones, it's a longer it's a longer period, of course. But I think the jury is out right now, and maybe this is why this documentary is apropos at this time, because you have a very an amazing explosion of these of the use of these tablets.
Now, the cool thing about Steve Jobs is this: he, through the kind of innovation that Apple's come up with, he's making us think differently about what information is, how we get it, how we process it, and how we use this technology, and very differentially.
So, and I think the iPad adds another level beyond the computer, simply because of that tactile and interactive nature.
I don't know what is intuitive about a sheet of glass to the kid. I mean, in a novel kind of way, you know, you push a button and it gives you feedback. You push a button and it gives you feedback. Is it intuitive based on, you know, your ability just to elicit a response from the machine?
It's somehow less interactive than certain other types of computers, isn't it? Yes, of course, you're touching it and you're double clicking and you're using your hands. It's a very, very tactile experience, but it's maybe deceptive in some ways because you're even farther removed, it seems, from the from the information, from the actual knowledge, right? So this is one of the many kind of paradoxes of technological history, that it gives you something, but it'll take something away, and that's what we're trying to figure out. What does it give us, and what does it take away?
It's hard to say what this generation of kids that has been brought up in an iPad from very early on. I mean, the difference between using the iPad and using a TV is that the iPad, the child isn't just passive in their learning. TV, they're very much passive in their learning. Here they have to react to it and typically do something, and I think they learn very early that if they do something, it will create something else. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's going to be different from TVs, but I'm not sure exactly what new way of thinking it will create. Time will tell.
Whether you're communicating via pictures, 144 characters, little pictures you post up on your pin board, I mean, the way that we express ourselves and interact with others rapidly changes. And I know that there are a lot of generations prior to mine that really struggle to see how you can make a meaningful connection with somebody else. And I kind of get that. And I'm imagining that the next generation of kids who grow up, being able to talk to each other over 144 characters and pull some meaning from that, not only will they be more adaptive to the next thing that comes along, but I think they'll also be more conscious communicators, because it's kind of this weird hybrid of synchronous and asynchronous communication technology.
A lot of adults are very frightened about the changes and the rapidity of change, and they're not Luddites. They're just scared people who worry that everything's passing them by, and that their ability to grapple and to interact with the world is diminishing.
Neuroplasticity simply means that the human nervous system, and therefore the patterns by which humans think, feel, and act, can be changed over time based on different events and experiences. The old theory of neuroplasticity was that it only applied during the early and late stages of human life. As human children developed into their adult bodies, so too did they develop their patterns of thought, feeling, and action, from things such as likes and dislikes to whether they learn or remember something best by hearing it, seeing it, or doing it. Conversely, as human adults entered the later years of their lives, these patterns, along with the rest of their bodies, began to break down. This at least partially explains why problems such as memory loss are common among senior citizens. But what about the middle stages of life? Well, it used to be thought that once a person reached a certain point in their adult life, they would experience a sort of brain freeze. That is, their nervous system would stop developing, and they would be stuck with whatever thought, feeling, and action patterns they had for the rest of their life. But modern science is beginning to show that this isn't quite the case. In fact, some scientists argue that a person's neuroplasticity can span their entire lifetime. And some, like Nicholas Carr, argue that new innovations, such as computers and the internet, may be changing how humans, even adults, not only do things, but also think about things.
The developmental spurts that children go through in the first 5-10 years of life are massively endowed with plasticity. The brain is changing itself as we develop. And the fact that these kids are being exposed to a certain environment will change the architecture of their brain when they become adult-like. So whether that is for the better or for the worse, we don't know. We'll know in 20 years when they become adults and they come to university and come into our classes.
It's a new way of learning for children. It's a new way of learning, and I doubt very much that it's not going to make a difference. Like, I would expect that it's going to make a difference to how they function as they get older. Just like I think the kids that are coming up now who've been exposed to TV from the very beginning are different from how I think in a huge way.
So there's obviously there's a big story there. I'm not sure it's transformational. I'm not sure it is going to change the way we put our pants on, right? But at the same time, it is what is new, I think, is as you say, the gesturality, if you will, of the media, because it's more tactile, right? So it introduces an extra element. That's where I think the newness is. I don't think it's deeply transformational though at yet. It's not proven yet.
I think the structural changes in the brain are not well understood yet from the impact of technology. However, you could hypothesize greater connectivity with the occipital cortex, a lot more information flowing at a much higher rate in through the eyes and into the occipital cortex, requires a much more intense network to process all that information. And so there's some evidence, for example, that highly proficient gamers, first-person shooter gamers, have more efficient attention, larger attention spans, better executive function. The jury is still out, but there is some very good evidence that they have better attention.
If you do something and you really work at it, then your brain changes.
I think what might happen with all this information really to hand from 6 months of age on up, like this, is that we open more windows for the mind to peer through, and we enhance the chances that more people will find something that absolutely, totally captivates them, and they have to find out more about that and go down that.
There'll be, and that's a little facetious, but I'm saying, on the one hand, I think they'll be more disposed to be naturally using the tools. They're like this netizen generation is intuitively linked with this new technology. There's no question about it.
One of the most amazing things about the human brain is its ability to adapt to the environment that it finds itself. So through evolutionary time, we didn't evolve specific abilities or niches. Well, we did, but we also evolved this general purpose mechanism that can learn in any environment. So if you think about our language acquisition device, as Chomsky calls it, it learns language in whatever environment it's in. Whatever it's exposed to, that's what it will acquire. And so these little kids, these infants, are being exposed to an environment that they never evolved to operate in, and yet they can adapt to that environment and make use of it, gain information, and manipulate their environment. And I think that is one of the quintessential human attributes of development, that we develop in our environment and we interact with that environment. The brain is one of the most complex organ that we know of, and the level of our understanding of the connectivity in the brain is still, I'd say, in its infancy.
The cerebral cortex is the outermost covering of the brain, which has evolved in humans further than in any other species, and what is most responsible for making humans human. It is also the structure most associated with higher mental functions. With its multiple folds, ridges, and grooves, the cortex is made up of two similar-looking hemispheres joined at the middle by an extensive bundle of nerve fibers which cross from side to side. One of the keys to understanding the brain is to recognize that nerve cells are highly interconnected. Any given nerve cell may make thousands of connections with other nerve cells. The orange-looking surface in this image is the cerebral cortex. Since the size of the brain is limited by the space within the skull, the only way to increase the amount of cortical tissue is to fold it. With a specialized method, we can look deep into the cortex and see individual cells. Here they appear black and have branches coming from them. As magnification increases, we see greater detail in the network of the branches. These are dendrites, which are the appendages of neurons which will receive synaptic connections from other cells. Connections are made with another specialized process called an axon. The place where communication occurs between an axon and a dendrite is called a synapse. Synapses are the communication links between neurons. Remember, thousands can occur along a single dendrite. Understanding how neuronal communication occurs at the synapse is one key to understanding the most interesting questions, like how memories are stored and how learning occurs.
So we know a lot about the pathways in the brain, but how those interact when we play with an iPad or interact through a Kinect, those are very germane questions that we really don't know the answer to. Now, when you turn to think about the development of the neocortex, so the outer shell of the brain that really defines us as a human species, we know that up until about 6 to 9 months, the cortex really is not that active in behavior. We're very instinctual animals. And there are these what are called islands of cortical activation that start sprouting up as the cortex becomes better wired and we're able to more inhibit our prepotent responses. So in 9 months is a real watershed age for that, where children all of a sudden are able to sort of stop poking their hand into an invisible barrier and reach around to grab the toy that they want. So at 8 months, they'll keep banging into the glass, whereas at 9 months, they'll do that for a bit, and then they'll realize if they just do this, they can grab the toy. So the prepotent response is inhibited, and that's because the cortex has come online and is allowed to put this top-down control on behavior. And I think we can all relate to the distinction between bottom-up and top-down control. Bottom-up control are those urges and impulses you have that control behavior. So if a ball is flying to your head, you grab it. And it's not that you thought cognitively, oh, I need to stop this ball from hitting me in the head, and so I reach up and grab it. Your brain, the old brain, takes over and does the action. But at the same time, if you're a soccer player and you want the ball to hit you on the head because that's the best way you can control the play, then you're going to exert top-down control and stop your hand and instead use your head to head the ball. So we have this, it's not a dichotomy, but this relation between our voluntary mechanisms that reside in the frontal lobe and in through the anterior cingulate cortex, and we have these more primitive bottom-up mechanisms. And I think the real challenge when you give a 6-month-old the iPad is that their frontal cortex isn't really wired up yet. And so it may be that this will spur on greater connectivity between the frontal cortex and provide them with greater inhibitory control in the future and greater executive function. But again, we don't know. It's an experiment. It may be that the maturation process can't be hurried up, and so you're not helping the child, and you may actually, so there are many developmentalists that would say providing activity for the brain before it's ready is not only not beneficial, but potentially detrimental, because the brain will develop maladaptive ways of processing the information, and when the more mature mechanisms come online, they'll have to sort of overcome these more primitive mechanisms that have developed.
We haven't thought about the little people, and they're using iPads, and they're like interacting with them, and at the time of life when the brain's its most elastic and it's most creative, I suppose. Yeah, I mean that has a lot of implications for that has a lot of implications for learning and how we're going to teach these kinds of kids, and what happens to children that don't have iPads.
Yes, yeah, it's pretty it's pretty amazing, and it's the kind of the 21st century technological version of snake oil, right? Because it appeals to the vanity of parents, you know, that there's some kind of magic elixir that is going to make your kids smarter, right?
People like Stephen Hawking, who are afflicted by neurological disorders, they have bliss boards that consist largely of symbols, and by touching these, the computer systems can activate a spoken routine to deliver spoken message.
Up until the 1920s, everyone thought the universe was essentially static and unchanging in time. Then it was discovered that the universe was expanding.
iBabies wired for life.
So we have been using touchscreen type devices for probably going on close to 2 decades now. So that sort of technology is not new for us. But recently the iPads, the iPods, the other sort of more mainstream touch screen technology has been added to our arsenal of devices that we can prescribe for individuals. And I think the main thing that it's added is that it is mainstream. So that if someone is using one of these devices, they don't look different, they feel more integrated into their community with their peers, particularly for children. So the big thing for us is that it has a cool factor.
I mean, there's been lots of studies on computer-assisted learning and using virtual reality to teach functional skills like crossing the road without getting run over.
Slide all the pennies to the right.
This is something they absolutely love. The apps are engaging, they are motivating, and yeah.
Well, the context provided is universal, and the gestures needed to activate and utilize the device are going to be universal. So this would be like a universal language, I would assume. I think what's important to understand is we accept language as very natural, we accept gestures as very natural. If the organism involved doesn't have the neurology to manage those sort of abilities, it's not at all natural to the organism.
Augmentative and alternative communication is anything that helps a person express themselves to something or someone else when one or more ways of getting their feelings and thoughts across are blocked off because of either a disease or a lack of development. Think about this in terms of babies. They can cry, laugh, or make other noises in an attempt to say something to adults, but adults can only guess from experience, either their own or those of others, what their youngsters are trying to communicate and why they are trying to communicate it.
That's very serious.
For example, experience can teach us that screaming, crying toddlers are trying to convey that they are upset and want attention, but it cannot precisely tell us why they feel this way.
Can you go?
Babies are not developed enough to change their feelings into intelligible spoken words and say, "I'm upset because I knocked over a vase which made a loud crashing sound when it broke, which scared me." Similarly, they are likely not developed enough to write legible words or images on a piece of paper to tell anyone what they are thinking or feeling. However, there are ways for babies, young children, and even adults with disabilities to express themselves despite their lack of reading, writing, and/or talking skills. They can point to things that interest them or reflect what they are thinking about or feeling. They can use symbols or sign language. They can even use speech-generating software to speak out whatever they type or touch. All of these methods are considered augmentative and alternative communication, And almost all of them are possible through gestural interface computers such as tablet computers and smartphones. One wonders if augmentative and alternative communication will become the literacy of the future.
Excited.
iBabies wired for life.
AAC, which is the term that you hear, stands for Augmentative and Alternative Communication, and that represents a whole range of strategies and equipment that can be used to allow someone to communicate when they're unable to use speech for face-to-face communication or manual handwriting for written communication.
So these seem to be natural alternatives when spoken speech is in some way compromised.
Our clinic is affiliated with the Assisted Devices Program of the Ministry of Health, which provides funding to prescribe these communication devices to individuals who require augmentative communication. And we can only prescribe one app, which is called Proloquo to Go by Assistiveware. And it's a communication-based program. And it's getting better, but like I say, up to this point in time, the versions that have been available, we've had to do a lot of customizing to make it really useful for the majority of our clients. So that's the only app that we can prescribe. So we're very limited in what we're doing with that. And again, it's not offering anything new or different than what we have available. In fact, it's not as good as a lot of the vocabulary sets and the organizations we had available on other devices. So the iPad apps need to catch up. Ever since we've had the computer technology and the speech generating technology, people in our field have been saying, why can't we just run this on an off-the-shelf computer? So now we're getting there. We're getting the apps for communication that are running off-the-shelf, affordable equipment, so it's good for our consumers. The technology is getting cheaper, so we're moving in the right direction.
What you're able to do, I think, is individualize to not only to the child's interests, but also to the developmental level, their ability to handle conceptual, symbolic information in a way that is faster, more efficient, and probably more fun.
Addiction to digital technology may cause some people to withdraw from society. While some of history's greatest thinkers have used this type of behavior for contemplation and self-improvement, experts say that these people should be treated as the exceptions and not the norm.
And I think this is what the challenge for technology has been all the way through down the centuries. It's like, is this going to make us better? Is it going to make us smarter?
Everything that we've used in terms of technology over the past few years or number of years is taking away a skill we once had. I mean, the ability to calculate change, the ability to be able to find your way around on a map. You know, there's so many skills that have been lost, but I do think that there are some other things that are developing along the wayside. And as I said, for our kids with special needs, you know, there are so many things that can be gained.
I do think that it extends the mind, extends a system of the mind, and coordinates a system of the mind. It coordinates more of the mind with the gestural system, and it extends the gestural system. And I think that that's going to enrich and make a more powerful mind that will think in sort of non-linguistic ways. And some of our most profound thinkers, like Einstein, people like this, have explicitly said that they did not think verbally. They thought in some kind of a gestural or geometric or visual sense. And then we later passed their ideas over to efforts to explain them. So I think that this may give that capacity an overt form that would be new. And of course, at some stage, I would still like to see it written out in language. But maybe we will have entire forms of discourse, whatever, that are sort of pre-language like. Because it's in there, it's in the head. Our heads do have that ability. And the language area is a specific area designed for a kind of social interaction. And this seems to give us a dimension of social interaction that bypasses language to some extent.
That sounds reasonable. I mean, the more you use a part of your brain, the stronger it becomes. They've done studies of they've done a really interesting study of London cab drivers, London and England cab drivers, people that can go through a city of 12 million people in all those boroughs, and they've basically memorized the city. And when they did fMRI studies on them, they found that the part of their brains were enlarged relative to that nonverbal part was enlarged relative to people that weren't cab drivers.
In thinking about the idea of multiple intelligences, so the idea that we have different mental skills that are mapped onto different parts of the brain, there's a long literature in the applied domain, but in the basic science domain, we have a very simple division between the left and the right hemisphere. So the left hemisphere typically does language and is our self-narrator, or the narrative that we engage with ourselves.
Please, Mrs. Howell, we have to find ourselves to these poles. When that tidal wave hit, these ropes will save your life.
Oh, I'm sorry, Professor, but they'll wrinkle my clothes. There must be another way.
And the right brain has another sort of view on the world that is much more spatially oriented and grounded in the physical reality of the universe we find ourselves in.
What's the matter? I can't fall asleep with all that snoring going on. I don't hear anything.
And so that distinction plays itself out in the way we can think about cognitive constructs. If we're limited to thinking just in a verbal domain, it constrains what we can conceptualize. So it's very difficult to verbalize the artistic brilliance of Dali or Mozart, whereas cognitively we can conceptualize ideas that can't be expressed in language or require a lot of concerted effort and clear thinking to convert it into a linguistic format that everybody can understand what you're talking about. So the reason people are visual artists or musical artists is they're conveying a different aspect of thinking than that's conveyed in language. Now, given our evolutionary past, language plays a very critical role in how we think, but we evolved many attributes of our thinking and attributes of the cortical design before we developed the ability to communicate.
I saw this film at some training of this guy. He was 19, and he had Asperger's, and he went to a big university down there, USC or something like that, in California, and he bombed. And the reason he bombed was he could not, for the life of him, make any friends. He couldn't have conversations with people. This is a kid with an IQ of 160 or something. What happened is in therapy, the therapist said to him, when you're talking with somebody, you ask questions. You ask them questions about themselves. And he said, "What? Why has no one ever told me this?"
Empathy is a really interesting cognitive construct that is maybe a uniquely human construct, or defines us as human beings. And when you think about the evolutionary history of empathy or the neural underpinnings of empathy, one of the key areas that's implicated is something called the mirror neuron system. And this is a set of neurons that have been discovered in macaque monkeys that are in the motor system. So they're actually neurons that respond when we make an action. So reaching, grabbing, putting food into our mouth. These motor neurons drive this behavior. And a subset of these neurons respond equally when you observe that behavior. So when you observe somebody with the intention of putting food into their mouth, the neuron that would act when I put food into my mouth in my brain is active in that empathic sort of way, in that modeling, that I'm modeling what that person is doing. And the theory put forward by a number of researchers is that empathy came out of that mirror neuron system, this ability to monitor what other people are doing and simulate it in your mind that gives you this empathic ability.
What is empathy? It's very complicated. When little babies are in a nursery and one baby cries, the other babies will cry in response. They just don't know why. That's empathic distress. It's built into their biology. Around 2.5 years of age, a child actually can begin to recognize himself in a mirror. That's when you begin to mature empathy as a cultural phenomenon. And that is once a toddler can identify themselves, then they know that if they're observing someone else have a feeling, they know that if they feel something, it's because they're feeling it because someone else has it. They're two separate beings. Selfhood goes together with empathic development. Increasing selfhood, increasing empathic development. Around 8 years of age, a child learns about birth and death. They learn where they came from, that they have a one and only life, that life is fragile and vulnerable, and one day they're going to die. That's the beginning of an existential trip. Because when a child learns about birth and death and they have a one and only life, they realize how fragile and vulnerable life is. It's very tough being alive on this planet, whether you're a human being or a fox navigating the forest. So when a child learns that life is vulnerable and fragile and that every moment is precious and that they have their own unique history, it allows the child then to experience another's plight in the same way. That other person or other being, could be another creature, has a one and only life. It's tough to be alive, and the odds are not always good. So if you think about the times that we've empathized with each other or fellow creatures, it's always because we felt their struggle. We have the width of death in empathy and the celebration of life. And we show solidarity with our compassion. Empathy is the opposite of utopia. There is no empathy in heaven. I guarantee you, I'll tell you before you get there. There isn't any empathy in heaven because there's no mortality. There's no empathy in utopia because there is no suffering. Empathy is grounded in the acknowledgement of death and the celebration of life and rooting for each other to flourish and be. It's based on our frailties and our imperfections. So when we talk about building an empathic civilization, we're not talking about utopia. We're talking about the ability of human beings to show solidarity not only with each other but our fellow creatures who have a one and only life on this little planet. We are Homo empathicus. So here's the question. We know that consciousness changes in history. The way our brain is wired today is not the way a medieval serf's brain would be wired, and their brain wouldn't be the same as the wiring of a forager hunter 30,000 years ago. So the question I asked at the beginning of this study 6 years ago is, how does consciousness change in history? Because I wanted to imagine the following proposition. Is it possible that we human beings who are soft-wired for empathic distress, is it possible we could actually extend our empathy to the entire human race as an extended family, and to our fellow creatures as part of our evolutionary family, and to the biosphere as our common community? If it's possible to imagine that, then we may be able to save our species and save our planet. And when I say to you tonight, if it's impossible to even imagine that, I don't see how we're going to make it. Empathy is the invisible hand. Empathy is what allows us to stretch our sensibility with another so that we can cohere in larger social units. To empathize is to civilize. To civilize is to empathize. With forager hunter societies, communication only extended to the local tribe and shouting distance. Everyone over in the next mountain was the alien other. So empathy only extended to blood ties. When we went to the great hydraulic agricultural civilization, script allowed us to extend the central nervous system and to annihilate more time and space and bring more people together. And the differentiation of skills and the increasing selfhood not only led to theological consciousness, but empathy now extended to a new fiction. And that is, instead of just associating with one's blood ties, we detribalized and began association based on religious ties. So a new fiction, Jews start to see all other Jews as extended family and empathize with Jews. Christians start to see all other Christians as extended family and empathize with Christians. Muslims, the same. When we get to the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution, and we extend markets now to larger areas and create a fiction called the nation state. And all of a sudden, the Brits start to see others in in Britain as extended family. The Germans start to see Germans as extended family, the Americans as Americans. There was no such thing as Germany. There was no such thing as France. These are fictions. But they allow us to extend our family so that we can have loyalties and identities based on the new complex energy communication revolutions we have that annihilate time and space. But if we have gone from empathy in blood ties to empathy in religious associational ties to empathy based on national identification, is it really a big stretch to imagine the new technologies allowing us to connect our empathy to the human race writ large in a single biosphere?
You augment those critical aspects of development with an iPad so that the infant can be exposed to a whole new realm of experiences and environments that they otherwise never would have imagined. I think that the possibility is great, that you could greatly enhance an infant's ability, but I don't have any data. We'll have to see how the experiments run, and I think there's a real danger that if it's done wrong, it might actually lead to worse performance in many skills than if it's done right. But I think that's true of any learning environment. You can always teach children the wrong thing.
Is digital technology an addictive drug? In the most literal sense, unless you've watched one too many science fiction films, the answer is not yet. That said, however, there are those who have espoused theories on how motivations for, and symptoms of, excessive digital technology use could make it fall under the category of an addiction. In terms of why people overuse digital technology, some argue that it has to do with instant gratification. With the advent of the internet, you can go out and find or do something without waiting for it to come to you. As we jump from one stimulus to another, are we really learning anything, or are we just being kept occupied? Some people compare our digital overload to a pinball game. Sure, we get excited when the ball whizzes around the board and the lights flash and the bells ring, but by the time we're done, have we really done anything meaningful, or have we just lost time that we're never going to get back?
How about it, Professor? Are we making any progress?
Intelligence is becoming a pancake. That's what they mean by flattening. No, pancakes are delicious. I'm actually kind of hungry right now.
It's chilly outdoors, but inside. For generations, frosty mornings have seemed warmer with stacks of
Aunt Jemima buckwheats.
Right, Aunt Jemima buckwheats, deep golden brown with a tantalizing buckwheat tang. It's the same today. Men still need a hearty, nourishing breakfast.
And men love Aunt Jemima buckwheat.
So I like this concept of pancake people. People who have very, very broad knowledge but don't know anything very well and can't think deeply about processes. And I don't have any evidence that we're developing a nation of people like that, but I could see how it would happen when it's so easy to extract information and so easy to find what you want that it doesn't require any deep cognitive processes. It doesn't require you to think deeply about the problem. And really, we know from the 70s on that deep processing, elaborative, connective processing, so taking information and relating it to all the other pieces of information we know, is what makes for good memory and for long memory and deep thinking. So if we are developing a whole generation or generations of pancake people, I think we're going to have a very difficult time in the future.
I think there is potential for learning, but I think at the same time you have to look at the cognitive effects of technology, of each technology, and this is essentially what Nicholas Carr says in the Shallows, right? That what he's trying to promote is this idea, is to ask the right questions of the technology. What is it doing to our brains? What is it doing to our ability to analyze? When we outsource memory, okay, what effect does that have on the quality of memory and the quality of that kind of alchemical quality of analysis that only can come from humans and not machines.
Technology is for sure changing our brains in that every experience we have changes the way our brain is wired and the way our brain operates. So there's no way we could introduce all this technology and not change the way we process the world.
I would make the following distinction regarding intellect. One is storing lots and lots of strange stuff in your head, which goes against my dictum of forgetting. And being a repository, as you said, a cathedral of learning in some way. Some of my colleagues are like this and many are not. Many are happy to have the data out there somewhere where they can lay their hands on it, know where to go to get it, and then know how to utilize it. I think the most important thing, the most important danger is the idea that the speed of the device, the quickness of the electronic world somehow should parallel or represent the needed time, the required time to address a problem or to make a solution to something. There are problems that are extraordinarily difficult, and in some cases one can spend decades of thought and research and still not come away with a completely satisfactory answer to some issue. I think that for people conditioned for immediate information retrieval, they have to distinguish between that and being able to use that information to come up with some new idea and some new pattern, some new insight, and that can take a long time. I remember once in an idle moment reading a math text, and there was a footnote to an axiom, and the footnote was John Horton Conway, and he is an interesting mathematician, knows lots of math, writes in all sorts of areas. But anyway, his footnote said that it took me 10 years to realize that this axiom had this form. 10 years on one line of the book. Okay, surely the rest of the book must have congealed in some intuitive way, and the 10 years might have been an impediment for that particular page or whatever. But that's not unusual. I'm not surprised. I was surprised by the honesty of the admission. I think that, yeah, we can have pancake people, but we can also have people who pull in all parts of the pancake and make a nice sort of wedding cake out of it, but it's not going to be the same kind of effort.
But we're not having to recall things as much because we can access it. So for our kids, that's definitely true because it's an advantage because they only have to recognize the information and touch it and access it, and it will speak the message. But when you think about just thinking in general, we really don't have to recall. You can't think of something, I'll just Google it and I'll get that information. So I can see that in my kids that, information is available anytime, anywhere, basically. So I'm wondering what impact that might have over memory strategies and that kind of thing.
Memory is a really hard construct to define in that there are many aspects of memory. There's explicit memory, what did I have for breakfast? There's implicit memory, how do I put a key into a door? There's familiarity, so the guy that I meet on the bus that I don't know where I know him, but I know him. There's explicit recall of my fiance and my wedding night. All of those things are different aspects of memory. So memory is a really difficult thing to define.
So there's a profound impact on the organization of the memory system by these early alterations, these early experiences. And as information accumulates in some way, a kind of core is left behind, and the newer stuff becomes, in some sense, more superficial and perhaps more immediately functional. Do I have to worry about that phone number? I'm never going to call him again? No, forget about it. And the phone number is forgotten too. And I sometimes tell my friends that what you forget is more important than what you remember. So you have to forget very carefully.
You have to remember to go to the web. You have to remember to go to the web page. So in a way you are remembering. And the way that our minds work, I think anyways, is that we remember what we need to remember. And that's all we remember.
I think it was Einstein that said, why memorize what you can look up in a book? I would rather spend my energy and my resources making connections than just memorizing facts.
There is a kind of an alchemical quality to remembering, okay, and to recreating the act of remembering that has an influence on how we analyze things, right? So if we completely outsource that great memory of ours, then I think we're asking for trouble in terms of our ability to analyze.
I don't know if in reality people are forgetting things because it's on the internet. I think that the people that go on the internet in a serious way are still the minority.
Yeah, there may be some value in going through a lesson slowly in a book versus being bombarded with information on the internet. I know I find it personally rewarding to learn a little new piece of information. Every time I pick up something new, it's like candy. I love it, and that's why sites like Reddit and formerly Dig can just take up my entire day. I could spend forever on those sites.
Kids have developed the inability to be able to attend over a period of time. One of the things that's evolved in TV for kids is this tendency to give information in really small chunks of information and move fast from sort of one part to another. So kids are growing up being able to sort of think like that and need kind of things to move from here to here to here to here. So almost in essence kind of multitasking but not being able to focus in one area at a time.
So I know that the human attentional system can really only do one thing at one time. Many people believe that we can multitask and do lots of different things. And in reality, the brain can only do one thing. So when you're multitasking, what you're doing is very rapidly shifting between the multiple tasks. And we know from other literature that there are huge task switching costs. So even if you know that I'm going to switch tasks on you, there is a residual task switch cost until the brain reconfigures itself to the new task.
And I think he's right. I mean, the multitasking, we can't tell if we're observing that the two aren't going on at the same time, but I think he's totally right. You can't, your brain can't do it, but the brain for people growing up now is programmed to be here for a split second, here for a split second, here for a split second, here for a split second. So I mean, yeah, I think he's totally right. You can't do two things at exactly the same time.
The opportunity is there for interactions that didn't exist before, and I think that we're better off for that. The costs are less than the gains in terms of communicating through the computers, in my opinion.
Do you think this is like a golden age for intelligence? Like, are we in a golden age right now? Just like culturally, like
yeah.
in history?
Oh yes, quite. That's hilarious. No, I don't think we're necessarily in a golden age. I think that information is available. We've got so much information available, but we seem to know a lot less. We're a lot more adept at manipulating things and creating video games and all that kind of stuff. But are we any closer to claiming that we've got this kind of supreme intelligence? I don't see it. I really don't.
How are you, Vern? I might as well tell you right off the bat, I don't cotton to any of this. I strung along with you because I figured you were smart, but smart people don't end up here. Ending up here, Vern? This is just the beginning.
So it's a remarkable period, and we're just at the beginning of it. They'll wonder in 2,000 or 3,000 years what it was like when it first happened.
So I would say in 5 and 10, maybe in 15 years, I don't see a radical change. I see more convenience, faster access to data, perhaps even kind of holographic or heads-up display, And I'm sure if this is played in 15 years, people are going to chuckle and say, well, I'm getting into my space shuttle, and this person was a Luddite. But I dare say that the history of technology usually gives us longer wave transformations than just those kind of radical breaks with the past. I don't see that happening. Although there are going to be some very wondrous technology, and I think that probably the greatest advances will likely, and the most frightening ones will probably be in biomedical the biomedical field.
Really, we won't know. We may never know, because in 20 years, so many things are going to be different about those kids than the kids that are going through university now. But embarking on the adventure of trying to figure out what are the possible benefits or costs of such a device is an intriguing one. And there are real research questions that you could address in the environment that exists, because some parents give these to their kids, and you can go and test those children, or you can give them iPads and see what the outcome is. You're engaged in a very social experiment, trying to gather information about what people who know about the brain or know about behavior or know about development think about this experiment. And so I guess in 20 years, either we'll all be really, really, really smart, or people will look back and say, well, they didn't really know anything.
It is apparent that gestural interfaces are the next big step in the quest to bridge the gap between humans and computers, an expanse that seems to be getting narrower by the year. The question remains, however, who or what is crossing this bridge, and in what direction? Computer control systems, visual interfaces, and even physical properties are now being designed to make computers look, feel, and act like objects that we use in everyday life. But this increased accessibility and familiarity may come at the price of the social qualities that make us human. As people, and especially young children, gravitate more and more to these new digital devices and their aesthetic pleasures, will their immersion in simulation and virtual worlds loosen their grip on reality? Or will their easy access to a vast network of information and communications lead them to develop new ways of thinking that will have profound impacts on the real world? It is still unclear exactly how the ever-changing world of digital technology affects human brains, especially those of toddlers and infants. What we have attempted to show in this film is that it is happening, and it is happening right now. It is a worldwide social experiment that shows little signs of slowing down or of being able to be controlled. You are what you think. The things a person does and the circumstances that they find themselves in, given enough repetition and time, will shape both a person's brain and their neural system. This will, in turn, change the person as a whole. It is on that note that we leave you with this question. Who are the iBabies? Or rather, who will they be?
We create the tools, and then the tools shape us.
Tie rope around of sin.